Yes. So, good evening. At the fourth day of our conversações seminar, hosted by the Graduate Program of Communication and Culture at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, we are glad and honored to have Tavia Nyong'o as guest speaker. He's chair and professor of theater and performance studies, professor of American studies, and professor of African American studies at Yale University. He wrote the Amalgamation Waltz, Race, Performance, and the Ruses of Memory from 2009, and Afro-Fabulations, the queer drama of Black life from 2018, among others. He co-edited with Joshua Chambers Letson, The Sense of Brown, from 2020, a posthumous books by José Muñoz. He's a member of the editorial collective of Social Text and of TDR, the well-known journal, a journal for performance studies, theater, and contemporary theater review. He also edits the Sexual Culture book series at NYU Press with Anne Pellegrin and Joshua Chambers Letson again. His current research and teaching interests span Black queer culture and performance studies, contemporary art and aesthetic theory, speculative genres, Afrofuturism, and Black sound studies. So his talk today has a shorter title that you have at what we sent to you. It's just non-binary Blackness. And so please be welcome.
Thank you, Professor Lopez Silva. I'm really pleased to be with you all, however remotely, and I wish I were in Rio, but we will make do with this mode of communication. I am going to present for about 40 minutes, I think it should be. And I'm going to share some images to help pass that time. So let me start by setting up my share screen. And then we will jump into things. Okay. All right. So always slightly. Okay, great. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So if non-binary identities are to be understood as refusals of the gender binary, then a problem for Black studies arises. Under what conditions can Black people refuse gender? Can Black people be guaranteed the personal agency assumed in the right to be exempted from male or female inscription in a society structured in white dominance? Or, to reverse the question, is the Black body perhaps the non-binary body par excellence, the body whose gender and sex have been subject to a wanton manipulation right from the very start? The debate underlying these two ways of framing the problem, I suggest, currently roils in Black studies. It is, yes, another debate about the intersections of race, gender, and sexuality, such as have constituted the field of our critical engagements for a generation now, for multiple generations. But it is one that is increasingly posed, as all debates perhaps must be, in the felt vocabularies and lived ways of experience of our own historical conjuncture. In this talk, I want to name that conjuncture both in the terms of our present tense, a tense that gives us the vocabulary of non-binary as among the gendered positions that subjects can take recourse to. And I should say both the present tense, but also my own present location in Lenape-Hoking, also known as Brooklyn, within what is called the United States. And hopefully we can have a conversation about where terms like non-binary do or do not travel as they go across outside of a US frame of reference and outside of an Anglophone frame of reference as well. So when I say present tense, I'm also thinking about the politics of location, and I hope you will remind me of those in our conversation, given that we are in this opportunity to think in a kind of deterritorialized gathering. So among the kinds of gendered positions that subjects can take recourse to, as well as in terms of the history of our present, a history I will trace back for reasons I will elaborate to the cultural shifts of the 1970s. But to begin in the present tense, then, there is today a current in contemporary Black thought that would construe any binary gender accorded to Black people to be little more than a catachresis, a misnaming for that which does not, cannot exist. We could, for convenience, associate this current with the Afro-pessimism of Frank Wilderson or Calvin Warren, among others. On the other hand, there is another strand that argues that anti-Blackness does not so much dehumanize Black folk as much as it casts us as, quote, sub, supra, and human simultaneously, to quote Zakiya Jackson, and that it does so in such a manner as to render Blackness violently plastic. This current I would associate with the speculative Black feminism of Jackson and Jana Brown, among others. To be sure, both positions take as a starting point the assumption, to evoke Marquise Bay, that the problem of anti-Blackness is a problem for gender. But as to the question of whether anti-Blackness must be thought of as casting the Black outside the ranks of the human, and thus of gender, normative or otherwise, or whether anti-Blackness is itself sexuating, as Jackson puts it, a problem emerges that holds resonance for both theory and strategy. To the extent that Black study shares in this problematic, it will therefore prove useful to investigate the ramifications of the post-millennial emergence of non-binary gender identities. We could clearly tell we could clearly tell the history of this present in centuries, since the debates opened up by the ontology of Blackness certainly pertain to the predicament of modernity, post-1492. We have the genius of thinkers such as Sylvia Wynter and Denise Ferreira da Silva to thank for equipping us to grapple with all the ways in which Christopher Columbus is still our contemporary. For present purposes, however, I want to delimit the history of the present to the half-century following after the global anti-systemic movements of 1968, and to the multiple crises that ushered in the 1970s, a decade in which racial capitalism and white supremacy reorganized rapidly in reaction to the existential threats of Black power, third world liberation, and women's and gay liberation. I tell the story of our present in terms of this period, both because the global counter-revolution of white supremacy that we are living through now has its most proximate point of origin in that decade, but also because the mutation in governmentality that we have come to call neoliberalism, with its proliferation of flexible subjects available for commodification, is most commonly seen as taking hold in those same years. Even as our vocabulary for understanding and intervening in gender and sexuality has been in perpetual flux since the 1970s, and again, here's a point we might think about, the paradox. On the one hand, there's an acceleration of and cycling of sort of new and discarded terminology around sex and gender since the 1970s. It is useful to linger in how that decade sets up what I'll be calling, after Nahum Chandler, the parentological stakes of flux for Black people. So in other words, there is this flux, but there also remains a what I'll call a para-ontological stake beneath that flux, or shaping that flux. To restate my opening question then, can Black people living in an anti-Black world refuse gender? Or would such a gesture be of necessity a refusal of a refusal, the declining of something that has not, in fact, ever been fully or evenly granted to us? Insofar as this is a question for or a question from Black transgender studies, invoking the recent formulations of C. Riley Snorton on the racial history of transgender identity will prove useful. For Snorton, the racial history of transgender identity points to the lived experiences of a set of Black, transgender, and gender nonconforming people for whom fungibility, seen as the principle that renders one Black exchangeable for another, and fugitivity, seen as the underground drive to evade recapture, are mutually entangled. In so doing, Snorton offers us one of the most compelling explanations as to why the visibility of representation is such a dilemma for Black trans studies. It is not that Black people do not transition. To the contrary, his history is replete with all the ways in which we have and do. It is rather that neither the point of departure nor of arrival for Black folk can in any sense be held as normative gender. And this has repercussions for what he terms the long exposure of transition in the second half of the 20th century. The transing of Blackness in Snorton's field reorienting work is quite literally Black on both sides, insofar as any refusal of normative gender, A, is a refusal of that which has always already been denied Blacks both in slavery and its sequels, and B, is not an exit from, but an intensification of certain intramural questions that have driven Black feminist theory since the 1970s. Snorton's work on the transing of Blackness resonates with Uri McMillan's genealogy of the Black feminist avatar projection on precisely this second question. McMillan's study of Adrian Piper's performances as the mythic being, for example, helps situate her hyperbolic citations of Black, or third world, as she sometimes terms it, masculinity in those actions as not, but none other than, a transing of Blackness. As I have also argued in my reading of these performances in Afro-Fabulations, Piper did more than don drag when she assumed the avatar of the mythic being. She also embarked on the project of rewriting her own diaries, starting from when she was a girl, from the imagined standpoint of a Black male. Importantly, rather than change the experiences of a heterosexual girl and young woman that her diary records, Piper instead imagined that what those same desires, experiences, and activities would be like for someone assigned male at birth. So if we think about a term that is quite important in Snorton's theoretical vocabulary, the concept of the heterotopia, we might consider how Piper's diaristic re-performances are a kind of heterotopic relocation of her own personal history, right, onto a different body, an experimental heterotopia. So she re-performed her crushes, friendships, experiments with drugs, and her work as an exotic dancer, all as the mythic being. While Piper does not represent this project as one of the affirmation of her true gender, her embodied avatar does open out both the male and female body into what Hortense Spillers would call a territory of cultural and political maneuver. And evoking Spillers at this stage in my argument is highly apropos, insofar as her concept of the ungendering of the Black body has been at the forefront of the intramural debate in Black thought. While much of this debate returns to the consequences that the traumatic rupture of the Middle Passage into slavery holds for Black people, for my purposes here, I want to highlight a relatively less emphasized context for Spillers' intervention, the notorious Moynihan Report of 1965, which those of you outside the US context may not know was a statement by on behalf of the government on the pathology of the Black family, and what was represented at the time as a liberal case for action based upon the overrepresentation of of women in the family and the underrepresentation of men, right? So a highly patriarchal, misogynist frame as represented as a empirically grounded social policy intervention. So at the end of the essay, in which her account of ungendering is most famously explored, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, Spillers invites her reader to speculate upon the political prospects of, quote, gaining the insurgent ground, unquote, for a Black feminism unbound by the racial unconscious of white bourgeois and radical reformism and feminisms. It is in the roughly 2 decades between 1965, when Moynihan issued his report on the Black family, and 1987, when Spillers issued her rejoinder, that I want to locate key moments in the gaining of this insurgent ground for speculative Black genders. One of these key moments, as I'll explore towards the end of this talk, is the early career of the inimitable Grace Jones. But before we back it up and pull up to Grace Jones's bumper, as it were, I want to return to the present tense to think a little more about Blackness and non-binary. While Blackness is older than modernity, and I guess that's a controversial statement, there are 2 views on that, at least 2 views, and gender variance has a rich and complex cross-cultural history, the adoption of the Anglophone term non-binary is quite recent, and for our purposes today, we might usefully think of it as post-millennial. It might not be an exaggeration to say, and at least this is my impression, that non-binary is a youth discourse, that it belongs to today's youth culture, which is not to imply that its adoption is without controversy, even among the young. In the essay from which I have adapted my title for this talk, the Black non-binary writer Hari Ziad uses Spillers, Saidiya Hartman, and other radical Black feminist theorists to make a bid for such an insurgent ground. Ziad relates their frustration with disidentifying from compulsory masculinity as a frustration that takes on a specific logic for Black non-binary folk. And here's a quote from Ziad that I realize is different than the quote on your screen. I apologize. Recently, Ziad writes, I've taken to discussing my gender much less. Conversations about my pronouns have been more annoying than affirming. Use whatever pronouns you like. I have found myself with less and less energy to correct being misgendered. No matter how much I explained, the world never seemed to make enough room for my being. I am only now realizing that this is because Blackness ruptures the laws of gender, just like the laws of the state seem intent on rupturing Black life. And also this idea that looking for language with which to represent Black genders and sexualities is like scouring for tools in an empty shed is another great quote from this essay, to which I recommend you all. Ziad goes on to offer a useful rendering of what Spillers' argument about ungendering might mean for Black non-binary social life and struggle in the present. If I convert the declarative title of their essay, My Gender is Black, into an interrogative in this present talk, it is not because I take any issue with what Ziad says. On the contrary, it is because what they say and how they say it opens up so many productive lines of flight. To ask, as if in slight disbelief, my gender is Black? Or perhaps in a more self-questioning spirit, is my gender Black? Seems to open out for me a set of questions that might even serve as the necessary sequel to the necessarily problematic closing prayer of Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks. Oh, my body, make of me always a man who questions. To blacken gender is to listen to the Black body ask the question Fanon couldn't quite pose, but that we must. It is not only to question the male body all the way to the end of that body's maleness and beyond, it is to ask with Nam Chandler how Blackness might evade the anxiety to which Fanon appears to consign it. If Fanon can hold open the possibility of bodily self-questioning, only on the condition of a gendered ontological grounding. The insurgent and rupturing tactics of ungendering move us towards the para-ontological. These are the lines of flight along which I want to invite us all to meet the spirit of Ziad's declaration, even as I will seek to marry that declarative spirit, as we've seen, with a fairly different enunciative modality. I have found this different modality in several places, but most immediately and related to the question of non-binary Black, in Marquise Bayes' recent short essay, again, I'm at a place in the year where all the essays I engage with are short. The problem of the Negro as a problem for gender. There are many ways into a reading of Bayes' text, but the most direct route here is to consider it an extensive meditation by way of a close reading of the theorist Nam Chandler and of why Blackness ruptures the laws of gender, as Ziad puts it. And what are these laws of gender that Blackness ruptures? The capacity of Blackness to rupture laws and norms of gender has a firm basis in the anthropology of modernity. As historian Jennifer Morgan shows in her study of early colonial accounts of African women, the ungendering of the Black female body as excessive and aberrant from the Western norm began even before the Middle Passage that it in part helped legitimate. In other words, the aberrance of the Black body helped legitimate enslavement. In Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, Spillers details how life, labor, and reproduction under slavery produced enslaved Black men, women, and children as exorbitant to, and yet necessary fodder for, the purity of the white household. And this is why I think this is a formulation that Rizvana Bradley uses that I find helpful, right? It's not just an ungendering, it's a gendered ungendering, right? The relation of the Black body to the gendering of the white household is itself a gendered process for Black men, women, and children. In Scenes of Subjection, Hartman studied the law of slavery to uncover the ruses wherein Black women were deemed incapable of refusing consent and therefore invisible victims of the crime of rape. Any attempt to fulfill gender roles as outlined outside of Blackness, Ziad explains, is not only ultimately futile in gaining Black people some sort of access to human treatment, but it also reinforces the violence against Black people who are attempting to build worlds that embrace their nonconformity. And just another shout out here to the work of Jana Brown in her new Black Utopias, Speculative Life and the Music of Other Worlds, where she really outlines in deep historical detail all the ways in which the refusal of the being refused human treatment has produced for Black subjects all of these different alternative ways of embracing life beyond the human, right? Which is not the same for Brown. These refusals are not for Brown the same thing as a post-humanism, but rather a kind of alternative history that makes the human in some ways defunct or irrelevant. So this point is buttressed by Spillers in her examination of the Moynihan Report, which repeatedly cites the law of the father in an attempt to demonstrate the pathology of Black female family structures. Again, I'll try to rein in my asides, but if you read the Moynihan Report, as I've had the misfortune to do, he literally cites the patronymic function, right? The presence of family names as a kind of endowment that has been unfairly denied Black people, right? And so the law of the father, the name of the father, is literalized over and over again as the building block of social structure, as if Moynihan were himself a kind of...
Excuse me, Tavia. We are not seeing your images. I don't know if you You are showing us
It's
something?
currently a blank image.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
so
Sorry about it.
no worries, no worries. I could stop sharing and then start it again, but that might just get me out of my flow.
Oh, sorry. It's up to you.
No worries, no worries. Actually, you did break. You broke my flow, so now I'm not sure what I'm
Sorry.
saying. No worries. I sometimes I just I show a blank screen. Maybe I should get back to my text. All I was saying is that Moynihan maybe it's apropos, right? That Moynihan has himself a kind of unconscious Lacanian. That was the point I would say, right? Which the interjection is quite a Lacanian response. So Spiller's critique of the way in which the Moynihan report conditions Black upward mobility on the entrance into a kind of human gendered norm, right, resonates also with points raised in the mid-90s by Kathy Cohen in a series of now classic essays in Black queer studies that theorize deviance as a site of resistance, not only for LGBTQIA plus infinity sign Black folk, but for others, such as straight reproductive mothers, whose sexuality is pathologized by the state's demonization of Black matriarchs and welfare queens. So where might non-binary Blackness, as a heuristic, build upon this tradition of Black feminist scholarship? I find Ziad's essay bracing in this respect, especially where they root their argument in an understanding that Blackness is not a race and that therefore could never be race first, that they could never be race first in terms of the traditional politics of representation. This refusal of the quote-unquote race man discourse, to cite Hazel Carby, that has dominated charismatic Black male leadership for over a century, is particularly worth lingering over, insofar as it resonates with the Black feminist arguments made, for example, by Carby and by Erica Edwards, which again dovetail with Black trans arguments made by scholars like Marquise Bey in terms of the para-ontological distinction between Blackness and Black people. And I'm getting to a kind of definition and gloss on para-ontology. So if you're not there with me yet, just stay there. What I mean to suggest here is that Black trans masculinity and related transings of Black maleness, such as we have seen with Adrian Piper and such as we will see with Grace Jones, can pioneer speculative modes of Black masculinity lived outside the dictates of patriarchal form. And this is a version of an argument that Jack Halberstam made, a long time ago, is that sometimes the most productive sites of masculinity can be cited, that we can look for, actually cited on bodies that are not assigned male at birth, right? So indeed, the Black queer vernacular discourse of masculine of center, which seems to have gone out of circulation. I'd like to bring it back. Tell me if it's gone out of circulation or I'm just out of the loop. Masculine of center, a phrase that encompasses a range of identities such as stud, butch, aggressive, and trans, may itself be a more useful way of thinking about gender outside the binary than the increasingly concretized cis/trans binary, insofar as it points to the way that non-binary Blackness is specifically about the refusal of anti-Black regulations of the flesh. So again, for what it's worth, even just kind of like vernacular Black vocabularies of gender may exceed the kind of top-down terminology that's one size fits all. The debate over whether Black people can refuse what has been refused us is my way of describing the debate over whether Black people can refuse what has been refused us, glossing the debate in that way, is my way of parsing the controversy introduced by Fanon over the absence of the possibility of Black people offering up ontological resistance, as he calls it, in the face of Blackness. Fred Moten joins Marquise Bey in looking to Nam Chandler for a way out of this Fanonian aporia, suggesting instead that, quote, in fact, Blackness offers para-ontological resistance to whiteness, which it brings into existence by way of that resistance, unquote. But how does Blackness provide this para-ontological resistance? And how might it be said to do so in the particular context of queer feminist refusals? To investigate this question, I will turn to a classic essay in Black speculative metaphysics, Evelyn Hammond's 1994 essay, Black Holes and the Geometry of Black Female Sexuality. Black Holes was an early but still trenchant response to the advent of queer theory and its promises of going beyond identity politics through a practice of subjectless critique. Assessing the potential of queer theory to go beyond the additive model of inclusion that had characterized both feminist and LGBTQIA+, I think at the time it was LGBT, work of that era, Hammonds gently, but as it turns out accurately, predicted that queer would most likely wind up being another adjective in an already long list of self-chosen identities, hence LGBTQIA, right? She thus anticipated some of the more sedimented layers of identity and ontology that younger critics like Bay continue to rebel against today, making her own strategies for de-sedimentation worthy of revisiting. 25 years after her intervention, I will suggest, we can still read Hammonds both for her caution against the exuberance that can sometimes accompany the adoption of new activist or theoretical vocabulary. And I'll kind of identify myself as of the generation that really thought that queer was going to do this like magical thing where we would no longer have to worry about the problems of the former generation, spoken with all the arrogance of youth. And the playful, so between that exuberance and the playful and more speculative manner in which she mobilizes the para-ontological terms that appear in her title. Indeed, I want to take up Black Holes in the almost science fictional terms. It pairs speculation on astrophysics and its paired speculations on astrophysics and geometry invite us to examine it. I also want to note, if only in passing, that even as this speculative turn in Black thought gains traction over the course of the post-1970s period that I'm calling neoliberal, it does not do so as an accommodation to the mutations of racial capitalism, but rather as an attempt to respond to this new historical conjuncture. And you can push back on this, but I'm really interested in the sort of two modalities of speculation. This is where the work of Amy Bong and others is crucial, right? Speculative futures are central to the financialized turn that neoliberalism takes post-1970s, right? But a different form of speculation is as central to the alternative world makings that Black and minoritized subjects are also engaging, precisely because that former turn has been made, right? So it's less of a question of refusal here is also another name for engagement, right? Or and it's a question of how do those who have been speculated on, how do speculative bodies become themselves speculative subjects? How do we engage in acts of speculation, having been ourselves traded commodities, right? Since the since 1492 and before, right? So Black holes, and just for variety here, I'll show now some black holes in space. The title of the essay, those of you who are unfamiliar with it, it sort of comes out of the linguistic turn. So there's a visual pun. Whole has a W in parentheses, so it's both the whole as in the entire and a hole as in something, as in an opening. So black holes, I will suggest here, gives us a speculative notion of non-binary blackness. What might it mean to think of Blackness, not just gender, but Blackness, as non-binary? The most apparent way, of course, would be to think of Blackness outside the binary with whiteness. And I think this is where Moden's quote about offering up a kind of resistance to whiteness is maybe moving us to, right? That there is a way in which saying that Blackness produces whiteness keeps us in this dialectical relation with whiteness, whereas pointing to a Blackness outside a binary with whiteness, or indifferent in some ways to whiteness, does something different, maybe more para-ontological. I think that's like the drive of that, admittedly excerpt from a larger section from a footnote in Fred Moten's Black and Blur. So the most apparent way, of course, would be to think of Blackness outside the binary with whiteness, a para-ontological thought of Blackness that would then lead directly into current debates over the matter of Black life. Non-binary Blackness, as I am positing it here, would be Blackness conceived outside of the binary into which anti-Blackness recurrently places it. It would be Blackness thought outside the white settler colonial triad of native, settler, and slave. Such a figure of non-binary Blackness might not satisfy the skeptical, for whom the power of Blackness consists in ontological negation. However, non-binary Blackness would trouble the very ontohistorical grounds upon which such discourses of negation stand. Non-binary Blackness would not so much be a social reality that we could point to or identify with, so much as it would be a thought experiment, a speculative fiction that we could use to read the figuration of race, gender, and the human in the contemporary. I want to nominate Black Holes, the essay, as an early statement in this non-binary Blackness, an episode in Black para-ontology. If para-ontology can, as Bay suggests it might be, itself be understood as a, quote, theoretical fiction, unquote. Although it might be feared that such a reading would decenter the Black female sexualities, which are the focus of Hammond's essay, I claim to the contrary that understanding her intervention as para-ontological renews the vigor of her Black queer feminist refusal, and that non-binary Blackness makes available new readings of corporeal performance and even lived experience, as I will turn to in my concluding example. In Black Holes, Hammond draws her titular analogy between Black women's invisibility and astronomical black holes from an essay by Michelle Wallace, to which Hammond was immediately drawn as a self-described former physics student. Seizing on Wallace's image, Hammond mobilizes it into two lines of theoretical flight that, put together, enable what I am calling a non-binary image of Blackness. There seem to me to be two problems, Hammond writes. One, the astrophysics of black holes, i.e., how do you deduce the presence of a black hole? And that's just, by the way, the image I'm showing you on the screen. This particular problem has been not exactly solved, but it's sort of been relocated by the discovery of black holes that form accretion disks because of the presence of a binary star in their orbit. So this is what we're looking at as a black star that actually is like incredibly bright, but that's for the astrophysics in the audience to clarify. Ordinarily, we think of the black hole as undetectable, except through as visually undetectable. So how do you deduce the presence of a black hole is the first question, right? And the second, what is it like inside of a black hole, right? It's a kind of fictional question, right? Imagine yourself inside a black hole. She mobilizes both astrophysics and geometry to propose a double strategy for problematizing that is worth citing at length here. I think I have that quote here. So to the first question, I suggest that we can detect the presence of a black hole by its effects on the region of space where it is located. One way that physicists do this is by observing binary star systems, such as the one I just showed you. Typically in these systems, one finds a visibly apparently normal, in quotes, star in close orbit with another body, such as a black hole, which is not seen optically, although that one, which I just showed you, was seen. The existence of the black hole is inferred from the fact that the visible star is in orbit and its shape is distorted in some way, or it is detected by the energies emanating from the region in space around the visible star that could not be produced by the visible star alone. And this is, again, that kind of, Moten's gloss on para-ontology, right? Therefore, the identification of a black hole requires the use of sensitive detectors of energy and distortion. In the case of Black female sexualities, this implies that we need to develop reading strategies that allow us to make visible the distorting and productive effects these sexualities produce in relation to more visible sexualities. To the second question, what is it like inside of a black hole? The answer is that we must think in terms of a different geometry. And it's part of what's complicating and provocative about this essay is that it's both about astrophysics and about geometry. So, if you were already on unsteady ground with relationship to STEM training, in one field, you have to do double duty. Rather than assuming that Black female sexualities are structured along an axis of normal and perverse, paralleling that of white women, we might find that for Black women, a different geometry operates. For example, acknowledging this difference, I could read the relationship between Shug and Celie in Alice Walker's The Color Purple as one which depicts desire between women and desire between women and men simultaneously in dynamic relationship rather than in opposition. This mapping of the geometry of Black female sexualities will perhaps require Black feminist theories to engage the Freudian paradigm more rigorously, or it may cause us to disrupt it. So it's almost an invitation for almost like a kind of a quantum multiplication of the sort of Freudian drive theory. As befits the historian of science and medicine that she is, Hammond's language is precise and clear. She proposes two modes of problematizing that desediment and interpretive problem, thus freeing up Black female sexuality from both binary thinking and binary gender. Roughly speaking, her first line of flight is relational, pertaining to Black sexuality as it impinges upon normative, i.e. white sexuality. And this is the part, so I'm just going on too many asides here, but this is the part, the relational is the part that sort of Moten and through Chandler wants to kind of place under erasure. And the second being intramural, pertaining to Black sexuality as it impinges upon itself. If I term these two strategies science fictional, it is not only because the first relational strategy is drawn explicitly from the study of the heavens and the movement of binary star systems that include one black hole, it is also because the second intramural strategy must almost necessarily evoke the problem of rendering legible, whether in a Freudian or other paradigm, relations that thrive and persist to the extent that they can remain underground and otherworldly. I've already given my impression that non-binary is a post-millennial term that emerges well after the speculative para-ontologies of Black feminist theorists like Spillers and Hammonds. Indeed, it is not a term that is racialized, even though, to borrow from Zakiya Jackson, its possibility of emergence into social legibility is premised upon the assumed plasticity of Blackened being. According to Jackson, and I would agree, Black plasticity is the onto-epistemic ground upon which all potential emergent contemporary genders and sexualities are made possible. So the unvoicing of Blackness within the kind of deployment of non-binary is precisely the mark of Blackness's presence, right? And when we think about what Grace Jones is doing kind of avant la lettre, we see a little bit of what some of Jackson's argument. If the advent of non-binary gender is certainly an invitation to think gender and sexuality in terms of a different geometry, the question that must then present us with is to what extent the racial history of such an invitation might be. To return to my opening question, is non-binary simply an additional identity position into which Blacks, like other subjects, can be included? Or, as Ziad insists, can Blackness itself be productively thought of as non-binary without thereby deflecting the intramural geometries that Hammonds insists remains the project of speculative Black queer feminism? How, perhaps, is the non-binary Black subject sexed? Is the non-binary Black subject sexed? What is their desire? And where is their rage? And these are not rhetorical questions. These are ones I'm actively thinking through, and would invite any comment and questioning on. Here it is worth noting in passing how non-binary gender points, however obliquely, towards the linguistic basis of sexual difference in a manner that may even cause some flashbacks for those who still recall the powerfully influential linguistic turn of the 1970s and 1980s. It's ironic, in other words, that I guess critics, activists coming up in my generation in sort of the 90s were kind of told, oh, this linguistic turn, it's all passé, it's going to be replaced by, I don't know, the internet. And what the internet gave us is actually the proliferation of new identities, such as, you know, the widespread adoption of categories like non-binary, which are themselves deeply linguistic and coded about codes, right? In grammatological terms, non-binary gender conducts an operation on language that leaves us momentarily unsure as to what its referent might or could be. If we put the point deconstructively, we might say that non-binary gender seeks to desediment gender in the double sense Bay brings our attention to when he speaks of para-ontology, meaning both para, that prefix, means by the side of the gender binary. So the hope is that somehow non-binary gender steps to the side of binary gender, whether or not that's possible, but there's the hope, you step to the side. But also, para is defend from or shelter, and at least in, I guess in French and sometimes in English as well, an umbrella can be, another term for an umbrella is a parasol. So a kind of covering or shelter that protects all those for whom the imposition of binary gender is an ontological violence. So this is, I think, a really productive moment in Bay, two ways of thinking about para-ontology that are specific to gender non-conforming Black being, which may be Black being. But a challenge presents itself when I offer this idea to my students, with whom this talk, by the way, is in dialogue. I need to credit all my students in my class this year. Isn't such a deconstruction of gender circular? How does running parallel to white normative gender not reinscribe the normative? Here, I need to return to Hammond's theoretical fiction of black holes. Hammond's image of the binary star system within which one is a black hole, within one in the system is a black hole, is actually not a bad way of grasping what non-binary gender does to the language of gender that is not simply circular. Following Hammond's, the image suggests that non-binary gender is always already in the Black, that non-binary gender is unthinkable outside the distorting and productive effects that Black female sexuality has upon white normative discourses of sexual difference. And here we should place Hammond's alongside Hortense Spillers' foundational rereading of the Black matriarchy thesis propounded by white sociologists and policymakers in the 60s and 70s, not just Moynihan, but many others. Against this pathologization of the Black maternal, Spillers elegantly proposed a reading of a symbolic terrain within which Black masculinity is, quote, touched by the power of the Black feminine, to name. It is the heritage of the mother that the African-American male must regain as an aspect of his own personhood, Spillers writes, the power of yes to the female within. While Spillers does not, again, I seem to have lined up the wrong slide, but this is another, when I was referring earlier to gaining the insurgent ground, and the idea of claiming monstrosity, which I'll get to at the end. This is all from the same essay. While Spillers does not give the name non-binary to the psychoanalytic consequences she sees spelled out as a consequence of the Middle Passage and the social death of slavery, she does at one point in the essay note at least a loss of normative gender as outcome. Under these conditions, she writes, we lose at least gender difference in the outcome, and the female body and the male body become a territory of cultural and political maneuver, not at all gender-related, gender-specific. And this passage, which I had on the screen, has been read in at least two ways. One is the loss of gender and the idea that we cannot use gender-related or gender-specific terms to think about Blackness, right? But what she actually says is we lose gender difference in the outcome, right? So there becomes a kind of non-teleological relation to gender, not a loss entirely of gender, right? But a territory of cultural and political maneuver, right? And a kind of loosening, right? A kind of a para-ontology of the female body and the male body from gender, right? And I think we have to understand gender here to be thought in specifically psychoanalytic terms, right? So there's a body and then there's a sort of symbolic order, right? It's more complicated than simply, a rejection of a gender analysis. While this quote, and here I'm going to say what I just said, paraphrase, has been used by some critics to legitimate a sidestepping of feminist and queer critique within Black studies, it would be my contention here that Spillers is actually inviting us to do the opposite, to imagine anti-normativity as central to the stakes of Black studies. Losing gender in the outcome, in other words, can be read as a nonlinear reading of the cultural and political maneuvers of sex and gender, rather than a suppression of such questions as objects of concern. Spillers helps us illuminate some of the stakes behind Hammond's second line of flight into geometries of Black desire that may or may not exceed Freudian frameworks. Which brings us to Grace Jones. Singer, model, actor, artist, memoirist, and the image on the right in particular, we asked the question of whether it does or doesn't exceed Freudian frameworks with that skillfully placed microphone. Jones has remained an icon across 5 decades, maintaining a signature look even as she perpetually morphs. A lot has been written recently about Jones, including by Jones herself, and as a result, we are getting a renaissance of critical engagement with her like perhaps never before. An exhibition that opened at Nottingham Contemporary in 2020, Grace Before Jones, Camera Disco Studio, stands out for its attention to her early career and for its de-emphasis on the notorious photographic collaborations with Jean-Paul Goude that tend to subsume all critical discussions of what her presence meant. As a dark-skinned, androgynous model, singer, muse, and performer across Europe and Americas in the 1980s. Anyone who follows Jones, Ricardo Montes notes in a useful book chapter on Jones and her collaborations with both Goude and Keith Haring. Anyone who follows Jones and the various ways people make sense of her knows that she is continually having to perform within and against intense scenes of social formation and political desire. Such a scene was very much on display, for instance, in her entry in the 1982 Illustrated Encyclopedia of Black Music, which grasped for a vocabulary not quite available to its author to describe what I'm here calling a non-binary Blackness. So this is the entry from the Illustrated Encyclopedia of Black Music when Jones had more or less kind of really come on the scene. And the brief entry opens with a biographical fable. Grace Jones believes that there was some genetic mix-up between her twin brother and herself. He played with the dolls. What Grace did was left unstated, but obvious with the references later in the paragraph to her developing a bisexual delivery in her vocal performance. What exactly is a bisexual delivery in vocal performance? The language is hazy but precise. We might even say, with Marquise Bay, that it is para-ontological. It doesn't name a search for new categories, but rather a way to find life and livability. This is a quote from Bay, a way to find life and livability in mutability and rearrangement toward the illegible. Bay translates the para-ontological life present in what the Illustrated Encyclopedia of Black Music wants to label the bisexual delivery of a genetic mix-up into our preferred contemporary terminology of trans and transing, and in so doing posits a confluence between transing and Blackness. Biological sex and the gender binary are those pure ultimate grounds that trans prefixly and analytically and corporeally displace and act as exorbitant to. Rather than accept this as simply a critical shift in terminology, I want to linger briefly in closing with what a transing of Grace Jones accomplishes in shifting the lens in which her performances are so frequently framed. And that dominant frame is the frame of primitivism. And ask what it might mean to shift to another frame made available through transgender theory, that of rage. So from primitivism to rage. Here I am, of course, thinking with Susan Stryker's performance of transgender rage against the biomedical machine, the performative desedimentation of the figure of woman that her text announces and for which it is scapegoated and punished by those who wish to violently resecure sex and gender to biological normativity. And here we can think of all the laws and regulations that are being passed right now against the rights of gender affirmation for not just transgender youth, but including transgender children. So at the end of Stryker's piece on transgender rage, she says, to encounter the transsexual body, that's her term, to apprehend a transgendered consciousness articulating itself is to risk a revelation of the constructedness of the natural order. Confronting the implications of this constructedness can summon up all the violation, loss, and separation inflicted by the gendering process that sustains the illusion of naturalness. Again, it would be the furthest thing from my purpose here in citing Stryker to ventriloquize a transsexual or transgender identity on behalf of Grace Jones any more than earlier when I looked at Adrian Piper discovering a identity, right? Probably also would be appropriate to mark the kind of the lack of sort of a racial specificity to Stryker's description of transgender rage. And so what I'm doing here is different insofar as I'm deriving it from a kind of Black non-binary rather than a kind of generic, unracially marked transgender consciousness. So my aim would be to juxtapose this rage with what Spillers calls gaining the insurgent ground by actually claiming monstrosity. Let me just go back to that. Yeah, we are less interested in joining the ranks of gendered femaleness than gaining the insurgent ground as female subject, actually claiming the monstrosity. And here the monstrosity is specifically the monstrosity attributed to the Black female subject, right? Which the culture imposes in blindness. And we see such an insurgent, I suggest in closing, in the words and performance of one Grace Jones song, William's Blood, which if technology permits, I will play some of. Okay.
You can't save me. You can't save a wretch much like me. When she was 17.
So I'm going to attempt to talk over this. If you can't hear me, tell me. Okay. And then I'm going to show a video with another version of this, and I'll shut up for that. I recognize that I will be upstaged by Grace Jones at all points in time and space. Co-written with Wendy Melvoin and Lisa Coleman of Prince and the Revolution fame, William's Blood was included on Jones's 2008 album Hurricane, a very autobiographical song. It is also a modern twist on the classic hymn Amazing Grace, a song which, incidentally, was originally composed by an English slave trader. The song relates her mother's flight from the itinerant life of her father to the settled piety of the wife of a preacher, and her disappointed hopes that Grace doesn't relish this opportunity to conform to respectable gender. William's Blood is just a song about rebelling against the law of the father, although you have to kind of like work it out exactly, right? You know, it's the identifying with the mother's father's way of rebelling against her own father, right? So it's rebelling against the law of the father as channeled through the mother, as voiced by the mother. At one level, a perfectly legible instance of rock rebellion. William's Blood routes that legibility through an illegible gender that, especially in performance, and we'll see, performs the flash and sparkle of what I want to call non-binary black rage. Refusing the patronymic Jones, right? Refusing even the first name Grace Jones claims the monstrosity of the power to name, summoning up all the violation, loss, and separation inflicted by the gendering process, and flinging it back at the audience with all the power she can muster. And let me just end by showing just a minute or two from Grace Jones performing William's Blood live. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you for such exciting ideas. And so just everybody who is listening, we are not seeing you, but if you have any questions, any observations, you can send to us in Portuguese or in English. Don't be shy. And just to, I don't know, I think the right is to break the ice. For those, some of us have been reading your work, especially Afro-Fabulations, to understand perhaps the frame of your recent research. Can you make a connection between this book and what you are doing now, or if you can? I don't know.
Yeah, sure. So maybe starting with the piece of the puzzle that connects the book and this current talk was the little piece on Adrian Piper, which I mentioned, right? And what it might mean to, well, I think that, you know, I spent a good deal of time, perhaps too much time, asking myself what a kind of queering or queer reading of the mythic being might be, given that I have no reason to believe or no reason to assert that Piper is a kind of queer subject, right? in identitarian ways. And but ultimately, in the book, rather than of course we can deploy this idea that queer is subjectless, but that only gains so much traction in 30 perhaps years in terms that originate in a kind of motile, flexible way, have a way of sedimenting into what are effectively identities, right? And so I have turned to what I see as a space that is in flux, at least in a U.S. context. Non-binary. There was actually this moment where I was in a public place in the last week. I can't remember where it was, and I overheard what sounded like a middle-aged woman explaining to a middle-aged man what non-binary gender meant. And it was like really, and more or less doing it correctly, in a way that was like, made me both heartened and also disappointed. Not disappointed, but I sort of like, oh, okay, so now this has been recognized, right? Like this is yet another term that is in the process of congealing into a stable locus of recognition, which the tradition of critique out of which I have been writing in Afro-Fabulations and in this project as well is deeply, deeply critical of, right? And so while I'm, I've always had it as this kind of, I don't want to go on in answer to your question, but like if we don't want, it's easy to say on one level we don't want, or like recognition, no thanks, but we also, or many of us, want to abolish the frame within which recognition currently is unequally conveyed, and to replace it with something different and better, right? So that implies tactics and strategy, and for me, rehearsing the last 50 year, or really like the fallout of the sort of transformations of which is what I was doing in Afro-Fabulations as well. And I think for this new project, I may ultimately try to like start in the 90s and move to the present, rather than like, because you just get bogged down in terminological disputes, you get bogged down in history, and I'm always trying to think about the history of the present, right? And in order to do that, you kind of have to update. The present's always moving on. So in the present moment, the questions that Bay and Ziad and Jackson and a number of other people that I can name are the ones that I hope to kind of be in dialogue with, even as I'm bringing in these older works. And ultimately, long answer to your question, making a case for speculation, and as a way of thinking through what has become a kind of stagnant or a roadblock, right? Between feeling pessimistic or nihilistic or despairing about politics in the present, and feeling obliged in some ways to be affirmative and joyful and hopeful. We all know that these aren't the only options on the table, right? They just don't describe fully, right? But how do we think and feel otherwise if we are moving beyond those alternatives, right? That itself is a kind of binary. So maybe underlying this idea of non-binary Black is like, how do we get Blackness, Black thought outside of this sort of binary set of debates, where people feel the need within Black studies to kind of like choose sides.
I see. There is an observation from our colleague, and it's not a question, but I'll read. It's from our colleague Liv Sovic. Fantastic flash of freedom. Oh, I'm sorry. Suddenly a question came. So, sorry. So fantastic flash of freedom. What comes to mind while listening and watching? And then there is a question from Vinicius Zacarias. Hello, Professor Nyong'o. My name is Vinicius Zacarias. I'm a PhD student in Ethnic Studies of Federal University of Bahia at Salvador. Oh my God. Now I'm developing a research about cultural Afro-queer movements, and the concept of Afro-Fabulation is central to my work. I think it was cut, or it's just, well, there is no question. I think they're saying, but anyway, then I think it's, I think now it's a question. Isabella Borsani. I had the opportunity of watching a performance of Brigitte Baptiste, a trans biological woman from Colombia who works an analogy between the mixture of biomas and the non-binary genres. I found at your presentation an analogy between sorry, I found at your presentation analogy between the non-binaries and the black hole. What I mean, the natural sciences. I would like to, if you could comment a little about the analogies between natural science and gender, and non-binary genders, that in a way can search for or can overcome a biological determinism. Was it comprehensible, more or less?
I think so. I think there maybe I'll do my best. And again, this is part of what one question I think could be perhaps the question of biological essentialism, right? And what non-binary Blackness, particularly if we are going to route it through the natural sciences, might offer. And here, kind of moving laterally from my talk to just the sort of field of engagement that this new work is coming out of, I'm in dialogue with, again, scholars like Zakiya Jackson, whose relationship to the natural sciences is quite specifically a relationship with biology, environmental biology, and medicine, right? So the study of epigenetics, and in a way, which is why I although Jackson's work also does encompass, she engages with Hammonds and with quantum mechanics. I at least find the analogy or the science fictional aspect of the proposal that Hammonds is suggesting. It's almost like an earlier version of what, more recently we have Karen Barad and her theories around intra-action and meeting the universe halfway, where it becomes, in sort of like feminist science and technology studies, there's a much stronger kind of claim that in fact, this is not analogy, this is how reality is, right? This is meeting the universe halfway. So it's no longer a question about certainly biological determinism in terms of an older sort of patriarchal science, right? But an articulation of a relationship to the scientific. This is again what I was saying earlier about like speculation. Like speculation is the sort of key mode in which financialization and predatory capitalism operates, and also the cognitive location of a lot of the thought that I'm most interested in. So how do you kind of parse that difference? The same is, I think, true of like the sciences, right? And then another thing I'll say without just going on at length, right, is that, there are a range of thinkers I'm interested in, whether we're Michelle Wright's The Physics of Blackness, Denise De Silva, who also has some really interesting excursus into quantum phenomenon, and even just the idea of the universe as a place in which Black thought can wonder and wander, which I find a really compelling and productive way out of a conception of Blackness which is tethered relationally to either resisting or acquiescing to kind of white supremacy, right? It's just it's just a start. I was gonna say it's just an image, but it's really more than an image, right? Like to look at the night sky and like the universe and think about the blackness of the universe, and also dark matter as a phenomenon, right? Of like all that portion of reality that contemporary science tells us it cannot measure. Dark matter, dark energy, these aren't concepts that are being invented by science fiction writers. It's not Octavia Butler or Samuel Delaney. These are scientists telling us about this, right? And so we can accept that and intensify those sort of contradictions, especially when and sort of use it against a certain mode of scientific reductionism and biological essentialism that tries to sort of pin gender and sexuality to a stable and known body, right, or a species, right? The only proviso there is, and then I'll stop, is that it is very important that we kind of always keep in mind that the idea of a body that can be perpetually rendered plastic or adaptable, right, is itself a deep, like the history of that is racialized, right? It's not innocent of race, right? And so the resistance that, Jana Brown, Fred Moten, Zakiya Jackson all have against this idea of the plastic as simply something to be kind of celebrated as a way of getting into the post-human is a consequence of recognizing that plasticity is not simply innocent, right? It's not an innocent term, even as it may be a necessary one. It's not abandoning plasticity, but it's understanding we see this, for instance, in here I really will shut up, I promise, but like there's some great readings of Grace Jones by, the one that comes foremost to mind would be Kara Keeling's reading in Queer Black Time, Queer Futures, where she looks at this late corporate cannibal, video in which Grace Jones's body is literally morphed in post-production into this liquid, not even plastic, but kind of like oil slick, right? And how that these series of provocations that she has engaged throughout her career are not understood by Grace Jones as necessarily as like direct resistance, right? But as a refusal of that which has been refused to her. Again, I think this is something that the Ricardo Montes is good on. But I'm just going to blather on if I don't stop. I see a question. Do you find Piper's philosophical writings useful to my project? Can I?
Yes, perhaps the last question.
Oh, okay. Okay.
I have got another one from but I think you perhaps.
Well, can I hear both, and then I can maybe.
Oh yes. So I think the other more complicated because I think so. It's just a sensation that I'm translating. So I'm putting myself that you are looking for a different vocabulary. Perhaps a tool different from intersectionality, post-humanism, and then speculative. If this is a right sensation, does it imply anything that goes beyond gender and race?
Okay, I'll take both of those. So I do find Piper's writings to be useful up to a point. I find that her, like especially her artist writings about the mythic being are tremendously useful. Piper also has this massive 2-volume philosophical project around Hume and Kant. And I think it's on Hume and Kant. And I can't say that I find it terribly useful. With all respect to Piper as an artist, her own conception of herself as a philosopher is in a tradition that we sometimes call Anglo-American. Again, it might be something that she entirely refuses. I don't know, but to me, it sort of seems to belong to a kind of Anglo-American tradition of analytic philosophy that I do not know how to access personally, right? So, but I would be happy to be informed, better informed about it. I have read it, and I've tried to find my points of entry into it. What the relationship is between, she herself has said that the relationship between her philosophical work and her artistic work is independent. So I've kind of taken that as like my, excuse to say that, I haven't sort of failed to engage if, it would clearly be better or something, but, I'm not an art historian. Ultimately, I don't know what I am, but I suppose most days it's a performance studies interdisciplinary scholar. And so I'm assembling things, from different locations, and in theory for me is always something that happens more in fragments, and in the kind of the post-philosophical fragmentation of discourse. That this is again thinking back to the moment I was thinking back to the literary to the linguistic turn, right? There was this desedimentation of philosophy. So to sort of reassemble philosophy into the history of philosophy is something that hasn't been my project, although I have tremendous respect for people who do. And then I wouldn't say this is a search for a different vocabulary, because part of what I would like to do, I'll just leave this as a thought. I'd hope that, ideally in some context where we were actually together, I wouldn't just be zooming in and out, we could kind of take time to sort of metabolize these differences. But I am conscious that speaking, from where my location and in English, sort of what maybe rises to the top is this idea of like a kind of a vocabulary, right? That is itself a problem for the circulation of the questions that I hope that we can ask, insofar as it then becomes, it centers translation, and then it also centers something like, I don't know, centers and peripheries, or the dissemination of new terminology. Part of my argument is that since the 70s, we have sought repeatedly to do that, and it hasn't worked, right? And so the reason I kind of labored over, maybe the only point I needed to make from the Hammonds piece is that, is when she doubted that the introduction of queer would do the work that it, she was 100% right. Like, it literally now is LGBTQI, so the search for a different vocabulary, maybe rather than a different vocabulary, I'm looking for a different grammar to look to Spillers, or a different poetics, to use a term from De Silva that I haven't really mentioned up to this point. But I'm very much interested in language, clearly, right? But vocabulary alone won't do it, right? Because it gets slotted into the frame of our neoliberal contemporary moment, and then it gets like vacuumed up into wherever, it gets vacuumed up into. And at the same time, there are all these vibrant and capacious aesthetic and political refusals. And I think some of them are being mentioned in the chat. I wish I were able to think more about all of them, right? But as well as I, right, that we don't need a language even to describe what's happening, right? It's happening already. Language is not catching up. In some cases, catching up, right? But also the language is there in flashes, I think, is probably a good word that someone mentioned earlier, right? How language flashes up at moments to become intermingled or entangled with performance, with aesthetics, with politics, and ultimately with like the performance of everyday life, right? With being, right? With non-binary Blackness.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry that I need to interrupt, but before finishing, I just want to remember that this series of talks and roundtables will go until tomorrow. And the last talk will be done by our colleague tomorrow at 5 p.m., not at 6 p.m., by Rafael Cardoso, that just released a book in English about modernism and race issues. So I think maybe these things can combine from the present to the past, and I invite you all. And really, we thank. There are lots of comments that they got me by the WhatsApp, thanking your conference, your ideas, and I hope you can make this personally sometime in the future, in recent future. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Danielson, so much for the invitation. Thank you all who listened. You can reach out if you didn't get your question answered. I can be found on Twitter and many other locations.
Okay.
Apparently. Okay.
Okay.
Bye.